Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, and I am thy host. And today's chapter is Genesis 39. Let's go ahead and read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. We've got another relatively short chapter. Genesis 39 has 23 verses. Let's go ahead and read it together. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house." Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant who you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Those are the 23 verses of Genesis chapter 39. Let me encourage you before we begin to go out online, if you have the opportunity, and download our free PDF, our outline for this chapter that contains all the key details. It's totally free on our website, tobelikechrist.com. Also, if you would like a book with all 50 outlines for Genesis, there's one available on Amazon, and you can find a link in the description. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about our text and remind ourselves of a little bit of context here. If you recall, 2 chapters ago, we were kind of reintroduced to Joseph when he was 17 years old, and we find out that he is the favorite son of his father, Jacob. We also find out that his other brothers hate him, and there's a couple reasons for that. Number 1, because he's the favorite. Number 2, because he sometimes brings back bad reports about his brothers shepherding to their father. And then number 3, Joseph had these dreams where all of his brothers and all of his family would bow down to him, and Joseph often shared these dreams with his brothers, and this made them mad. There was no reason that Joseph would be superior in any way to all of them to the point where they would have to bow down to him. So they hate him. They hate him so much that they're actually ready to kill him. But instead of killing him, they throw him in a pit, and then they sell him to some Ishmaelites who are on their way to Egypt. They say, if we kill him, we got to hide the body, and our hands will be bloody, and why don't we just sell him? At least we can get some profit out of him. So they sell him for 20 pieces of silver, and Joseph is taken as a slave down to Egypt. The end of chapter 37, we learn that Joseph was sold into the house of Potiphar, who was an officer of Pharaoh's, and that's kind of where we pick up in chapter 39. In chapter 38, the last chapter, we kind of took that aside and discussed not Joseph, but his older brother Judah. And Judah and the situation with Tamar, his daughter-in-law, and what happened there. If you want to go back and review that, you can. But really, chapter 37 is kind of the context in which we're picking up here now in chapter 39, picking back up on the story of Joseph. To establish our foundation for the chapter, let's first talk about when these events occurred, the main characters of the chapter, and where the events occurred. This is going to be shorter than most chapters, pretty straightforward information here. Joseph was 17 years old when he went to Egypt. That would be approximately 1728 BC, based on the timeline that we've been using. We're told that he's 17 years old in the beginning of chapter 37, so we know that for sure. Main characters for today. Joseph, he is Jacob's son with Rachel. You remember Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. Joseph's brothers hated him and sold him into slavery. We have this individual named Potiphar who is going to buy Joseph when he arrives in Egypt. He is an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of Pharaoh's guard, so seems like a pretty significant man in Egypt. And then we have Potiphar's wife. We don't know her name, but she lies about Joseph and later gets him thrown into prison. Talk about her in our outline section. That brings us to our map, and our map is expanded out again from Canaan. We're looking to the south this time, south and to the west of Canaan. You now see Egypt in the picture, and a lot of Joseph's story, well, really the rest of Joseph's story, is going to take place in the land of Egypt. We're not told specifically where in Egypt Joseph was located at this time. Egypt was approximately 450 to 500 miles away from Canaan, which is where Joseph's brothers and his father lived. Now we can begin our outlining of the chapter, break the chapter down into sections and make sure that we understand what we just read. This is still really the beginning of Joseph's story. There are many years that we're going to be talking about Joseph and a number of chapters that we're going to be talking about him. So this is kind of chapter number 2 in the life of Joseph. Chapter 1, I guess, would be him being sold into slavery by his brothers. But now he's in Potiphar's house, and that's the title of our first section today, Joseph in Potiphar's house, verses 1 through 6. After Joseph's brothers sold him, he was brought to Egypt and sold again to Potiphar, who was an officer of Pharaoh. And if you don't know, Pharaoh is just a title for the king of Egypt. I imagine most people know that. Most people have seen The Prince of Egypt, the Disney movie that came out in, like the early 2000s, which, what happened to Disney? They were making some good stuff, and then and then they fell off a cliff. But anyway, sorry. I will not get started on my rant on Disney. But if you've ever seen The Prince of Egypt, or better yet, The 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston, which came out in like the 50s or something, I don't know, you're going to know about Pharaoh. Joseph served Potiphar faithfully when he was in his house. It doesn't seem that he sat around moping. He didn't say, it's not fair. My brothers have sold me into slavery, and now I'm just going to sit around and I'm not going to serve anybody faithfully. I'm not going to do a good job. I'm just going to sit around and mope. He doesn't seem to have that attitude at all. And we see this throughout Joseph's life. Joseph serves Potiphar faithfully, even though it's unfair, technically, that he's in that situation. He does a good job for his master. And I think this is very likely because of the respect that he has for God. We're going to see that in what happens to Joseph in Potiphar's house. He has a high respect for the Lord and for what's morally right. And anyone who has a respect for the Lord is going to do a good job in whatever work they're involved in because they're working for the Lord. They're not working for men, as the New Testament tells us. Potiphar recognizes Joseph's hard work and he elevates him in his household. He also sees that it's the Lord's blessing on Joseph's life that is ultimately the thing that is blessing his household. He makes Joseph the overseer of his house and all of his possessions. The text says that Potiphar didn't really pay attention to anything except the food that he was supposed to eat that day because he trusted Joseph so much, and Joseph was so good at his job that he just gave over everything to him and let him manage it. And it was working out great for Potiphar. The Lord's blessing was on Potiphar's house. It says both his house and his fields because of Joseph. It kind of reminds us of the story we read about with Jacob, how Laban's house was blessed because God was with Jacob and was assisting him in everything that he was doing. So everything was going, I guess, as well as it could have gone for being sold into slavery in the beginning of chapter 39. But there is a problem that arises in the next couple verses. This is going to be section number 2, the end of verse 6 through verse 20. Potiphar's wife lies about Joseph. The text tells us that Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance. So he's a good-looking guy, and this doesn't go unnoticed. Potiphar's wife starts to find Joseph to be very attractive, and she tries to seduce him. But Joseph refuses, and you notice in the text his respect for God when he says, how can I do this? My master's put everything into my hands and under my management, and everything is in my power except for you because you're his wife. So he says, how can I do this wicked thing and sin against God? He told her that he was not going to break Potiphar's trust, and he was not going to sin against the Lord. Well, that didn't dissuade her for too long. She tried repeatedly to seduce him, but he continued to refuse. One day, though, when Joseph came into the house to do his work, he was there with her alone. All the other men, for some reason, were out of the house. And she grabbed him. She grabbed his garment, and she insisted again that he sleep with her. But Joseph ran out of the house, but he left his garment behind, probably because she had a hold of it. Potiphar's wife at this point seems to be getting a little bitter, a little resentful that she can't get what she wants. And so she lies to the men of the house, and she also lies to Potiphar when he comes home, and she tells him that it was actually Joseph who was trying to seduce her, but he fled without his garment when she cried out for help. Potiphar believes his wife. He shouldn't have, but he believes his wife, and he's furious at Joseph. And Joseph seems like doesn't get to tell his side of the story. He's just a slave. His word's not as meaningful as the wife of Potiphar. And so Joseph gets thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were jailed. So you think about Joseph's story, he didn't deserve to get thrown or to get sold into slavery by his brothers. That was very harsh treatment. And now, he's kind of in the second phase of his life, and something kind of similar happens to him, in that he's treated unfairly. And this time he's treated unfairly for doing the right thing. He's trying to honor God. He's trying to honor his master who has put trust in him. And this happens to him. So if you're Joseph, you're sitting in prison after you've been lied about, after you tried to be a moral person. And again, it would have been easy to just be kind of resentful, to kind of sit around and be like, well, this isn't fair. God isn't with me. If God was with me, none of this would have been allowed to happen. And so boo-hoo, woe is me. And, my life's it's not fair. That admittedly might have been my attitude if something like this or these things had happened to me. But again, we see Joseph's godly attitude and his faith that God is still with him, even though his circumstances aren't ideal. We see that in section 3. This section I've just entitled Joseph in Prison, verses 21 through 23. This takes us through the end of the chapter. And I have just a quotation from the text here to begin. It says, quote, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." So once again, we see Joseph winning the favor of the man who was over him, because Joseph is a good worker and a faithful worker, and because God's blessing is upon him. I think there's an interesting observation from the text that we can see here. It says that God showed him steadfast love. Now, if you were in prison unfairly, would you say, oh yeah, clearly God is showing me steadfast love? I think we'd be more tempted to say, oh, God forgot about me and his love must have passed over me, and that's how I ended up in this situation. But what we find out is that God is very much with Joseph. God has a great plan for Joseph's life, but that plan requires Joseph going through this prison first. And so although his circumstances are maybe not the most obvious manifestation of God's love, the text tells us that God's love is very much with him as he's in these circumstances. And so when we think about that in terms of our own lives, just because the circumstances of our life aren't ideal at the moment, it doesn't mean that God has withdrawn his love from us. It doesn't mean that he's not with us. It doesn't mean that he's not caring for us or showing us his affection. He very likely has a plan that requires us to go through these poor circumstances so that he can use us in some way in his kingdom. But it's wrong to conclude that just because your circumstances aren't ideal, that means that God doesn't love you or that he's forgotten about you. And I think that's a very key lesson from this text and from this particular verse in the Bible. Joseph was put in charge of all of the daily tasks of the prison, and the keeper of the prison trusted him so much that he didn't even check on his work. He wasn't worried about him doing unethical things or doing anything sketchy or smuggling things into the prison or nothing like that. We see Joseph here again, even though his station in life has decreased, the same thing is happening. He's winning the affection and the trust of those who are above him, who have charge of him. And once again, we read that whatever Joseph did, whatever he put his mind to and his hands to, the Lord caused it to succeed. So that's where we're going to leave off in chapter 39 today. We have a very positive picture of this young man Joseph being painted for us, and that's really going to continue throughout his story. This is a young man who will become an older man of very high character. We'll now talk about our application. I think I kind of walked all over my application, though, with what we were just talking about. This might be a little bit of a repeat. I forgot that I had this down at the bottom of the page, but a little repetition never hurt anybody. So our application for today, being a servant of God doesn't always mean that you get immediate justice, but it does mean you'll never be separated from the love of God. Joseph was thrown into prison for doing the right thing, and he wasn't immediately vindicated for this. But the text tells us, as we just read, that God, quote, showed him steadfast love while he was in prison. Being in God's love doesn't mean you will never be treated unfairly. It means God will never forsake you, even when you're mistreated by a sinful world. We certainly see that in Joseph's story already, and we're not even that far into it. God was with him in Canaan, God was with him in Potiphar's house, and now God is with him even in kind of the bottom of life in prison. Where will Joseph go next? I think you might be surprised, but keep in mind those dreams that Joseph had back in Canaan and what those prophetically spoke about. I gave you a hint, and I said that they are indeed prophetic. They speak of future events. So keep those in mind as we think about maybe where Joseph's direction is going to be next. But he still has some time in his prison, and he's going to meet some people in prison, and they're going to be significant to his future story. But we'll talk about that in upcoming studies. Thanks for joining me today for Genesis 39. Lord willing, we'll be back to jump into the 40s tomorrow.